My dear friends, it is good to be with you again. Here just 2 weeks since the burial of my beloved mother, Morosi, my teacher, Maras Esther Malka Bas Avram Yeshua, Esther Malka, daughter of Avraham Yeshua, after whom I was named, her father, my grandfather. And today I would like to speak to you about my mother and her significance to me, and I believe as an example of the truly righteous of Israel. She was born on the 14th of Tevet in the year Tarpab, 6000 682, that is the year 1922, and she was taken from us on the 11th of Tevet of this year of Tafshin Ayin Chet, and she was laid to rest side by side with my beloved father, Rabbi Yumori Yaakov Reb Moshe Eliyahu, known as Mr. Jack Graham, for reasons that I shall elaborate on later. But the story does begin in the city of London, the city of Malchut, the city of kingship, and it was to London that the parents of my late grandmother came in the 1890s from Poland, and so too the father of my mother, who became the husband of my mother's mother, my maternal grandfather, Avram Yeshua, came also from Warsaw in the same period, and the pair married in America. They were in London, but my paternal grandfather wanted to go to New York to seek out his fortune, and so he was there in New York, and my grandmother, as yet unmarried, traveled to New York with a great deal of seasickness on the ship, and he was working there as a craftsman, a maker of golden chains and of jewelry. And my grandmother had a longing for the imperial city, the center of the aspirations of the Jews who had been fleeing from the tyrannies of Eastern Europe. And there my maternal grandfather, my maternal grandmother, having been married, came back to London. And it was in the area of the East End of London that the pair came to live. And today the area is still there, the area of Whitechapel, just to the east of the City of London, and very near to the then Port of London, to which the immigrants would come in. And of course it was quite a different world back then. It was in the 1920s. There was still some horse-drawn carriages and early cars and buses that to us look very antiquated. And it was in that eastern part of London that my mother was born and grew up as a girl. And coming back to the imperial side of London, London indeed is the center of Malchut, the center of kingship. And we as Jews every day take on the kingship of God in our prayers time and time again. It's like the soldiers that are marching and performing for the honor of the monarch. So too we in the synagogues declare the kingship of the Almighty. Those who have lost loved ones, close relatives, those who are in mourning recite daily in the synagogue, Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei Rabo. Let his great name be magnified and sanctified. That is the invitation of the leader of the minyan, of the prayer group of men who are praying. That is the invitation to all to join in the declaration, Yehei Shmei Rabo Mevoroch Leolam Uleolmayo. Let his great name be blessed forever and for all of the eternities upon eternities. And with this we are declaring Yehei Shmei Rabo, his name, when it will be great, when it will be exalted, when it will be sanctified, when it will go across all the world, then that will be the time of true peace, the time of true Mashiach. And every day in the repeated Kaddish that we say time after time, times in the morning in the Shacharit, the Kaddish D'Rabbanan, the introductory Kaddish, then the Kaddish before Baruch Hu, the invitation to joint prayer, the Kaddish after the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, and then there is the Kaddish Tiskabel after Ashrei Lamnatzeach Uvolet Zion, and then there is the Kaddish after the Shir Shel Yom, and then there is the Kaddish after Ein Kelokeinu, many, many, many Kaddishes. And as a little boy, when I was being brought up in the community of St. John's Wood and Maida Vale, to which my parents moved after they married, one of the places that my mother introduced me to was the very beautiful St. John's Wood Synagogue, which is in a road that is very famous by the name of Abbey Road because of a famous number of people who, about 250 yards away from this beautiful synagogue, took the photograph. But the synagogue itself was a world unto itself, the vantage point from which we see it's now called the New London Synagogue, but in my boyhood was the St. John's Wood Community Synagogue. It's from this vantage point you can actually see the reader's desk and the ark of the Sefer Torah, and here exactly was where my mother would sit. That was her seat. She had a box there to keep her prayer book and her festival prayer books and her Chumash, her Bible. And when I would come up to her during the long Yom Kippur services as a boy, I would sit next to her, and we would hear together and watch down at the assembled congregation the prayers of Yom Kippur in this very synagogue. But as a boy growing into my teens, I was very disturbed by the people that would sit often in some of the most prominent positions in the synagogue, and during the prayers and during the Torah reading, they were busy chatting about sports and business and heaven knows what. And I would come home to my mother boiling after the Shabbat service in the morning, boiling and saying, "What is this? What is happening here?" I would boil at it. And here my mother gave me one of the great pieces of advice that I've carried with me ever since. And that is that she said to me, "My beloved son, don't imagine that Judaism is what you see in those people. If you want to know the true Judaism, then you must go to the sources. And if you will study the sources, there you will find the truth of our tradition." Well, that has served me ever since, and even though I did run away from that community, and a beautiful community it was, they had some of the finest stained glass windows in the synagogue evoking the Jewish festivals, the Shabbat, and Rosh Hashanah, and Sukkot, and a whole set of 12 sets of 3 each stained glass windows made by the late Rabbi David Hillman, alav shalom, zecher tzadik livrocho, who I was worthy to see in the St. John's Wood Synagogue on Yom Kippur with his kittel, a small man whose face was entirely pure and radiant, with tears streaming down his cheeks in the purest innocence of contrition and repentance. And certainly there were aspects of the synagogue and its liturgy when one heard the chazanut at key points in the high holidays that were so exquisitely beautiful. But to my boyhood ears, this repetition of Yehi Shemei Rabo, Yehi Shemei Rabo, Yehi Shemei Rabo, again and again, to the point that it's coming, driving you to distraction, even though people never tire of the monarch's guards changing and passing through the same rituals time after time. People never tire of seeing these things, but somehow the synagogue can become, for many people, somewhat wearing. And it's strange that now, as I come into my late 60s, I've been in an area of Jerusalem known as the Mea Shearim district, which I once had a dream about in the late 1970s. I was talking to a school day friend, and we were standing in Mea Shearim, which I'd seen once in 1970 as a non-religious tourist to Israel. And I was living there, and this came to be when I moved into Mea Shearim, the actual street known as the Street of the 100 Gates of Prayer, because of the 100 little synagogues there. In the year 1988, through some help with my dear late parents, Alehem HaShalom. And I've lived in the district ever since, and one of the places that I've spent very much time praying in is a place called Zichron Moshe. This is the synagogue in the area known as Zichron Moshe, which is just between Jaffa Street, north of Jaffa, north of Nevi'im, and just south of Malchei Yisrael and Geula, the area in between, which was built up in the 1800s by Sir Moses Montefiore, the very well-known British philanthropist, who among his other gifts to Jerusalem, including the Jerusalem windmill, produced what is actually a very fine synagogue inside, with the main synagogue seating probably about 300 to 400 people squashed in on the high holidays. And in fact, if you talk about squashed in, that is really what the Zichron Moshe synagogue is all about in this district, day after day. This is, one might say, the proverbial minion factory. What you see here is the entrance to what is known as the Shtibelach, a shtibel being a small shtib. A shtib is a room, and the Shtibelach are little rooms that were built on to the west of the original structure of the very fine 19th century Jerusalem synagogue, seating these 300, and probably they passed through Zichron Moshe on the average day. I would not like to hazard a guess at how many thousands. We say that Abraham instituted the Shacharit service, and the earliest time you pray is in the morning, Isaac, Mincha, Yaakov, Ma'ariv, and before Abraham is Terach, and even before the dawn, there is the Terach minyan, starting off several millions of people who have to get to work before the day is light for other people, and from then on through the Netz minions, the minions of the dawn, followed by minions where you have the stragglers still praying at 11:30, 12, and private people, individuals continuing on throughout the rest of the day. But by 12 o'clock, we're getting ready for Mincha Gadol, and then streams of people are coming in for the afternoon service, and then the afternoon service goes until the sun is set and it's pretty dark, and then already Ma'ariv, we're starting the evening service. This is a minion factory. And again and again and again, these words are heard, Yiskadel v'yiskadel Shemei Rabo, you hear again and again, and you have to answer, you have to stand to attention like the soldiers. And now, a great lesson that my beloved mother has taught me now that she has left us, and we are in the year of Avelus. When I'm seeking to attend the synagogue regularly, I was sometimes inclined to be a shirker of minions and to pray alone, although it is required and even mandatory to pray with a minyan. And now, having parted from us, she won't let me do that anymore, because for this year, B'li Neder, I have to recite the Kaddish to elevate her neshama in the heavens. It is the acceptance of God's din, his judgment, that we call upon his great name to be magnified and sanctified. And here, after she's passing, she's teaching me the next very great lesson, a lesson which is expressed in the prophet Isaiah in chapter 62, starting at verses 6 and 7, where the prophet says to us, Al chomosayich Yerushalayim hifkarati shomrim kol hayom v'chol halaylo tomid lo yecheshu hamaskirim es Adonai al domi lochem, al tnitnu domi loi ad yechonen va'ad yosim es Yerushalayim, tehilo ba'oretz. Upon your ramparts, O Jerusalem, have I appointed the guards all the day and all the night. Constantly, they shall never be silent, those who are recalling Hashem or reminding Hashem. Let there be no silence to them, and give no silence to him until he will establish, until he will place Jerusalem as a praise in the earth. And this is now the lesson that I'm learning about the guards who are there from morning until night, and they're constantly marching and trumpeting not the dead but the living God, and teaching and declaring time and time from morning till night and through the night that the living God is alive and sends his salvation. So I've learned now to be a little more patient in attending the synagogue and reciting the daily prayers. And as I open my ears to what is going on in the synagogue, in the minion factory of Zichron Moshe, I realize it's far more mysterious than you might think. There's a man I particularly admire for his ability to daven at great speed, and he manages to intone every word and singing up and down the scale most beautifully. A man that I've been hearing in Zichron Moshe without ever even looking him in the eye or being introduced to him or speaking to him, because it's a very strange, solitary experience to be in these shtibelach, very crowded, sweaty, and sometimes difficult physically in the summer when before there was air conditioning in the late 80s and early 90s, before they could afford to install air conditioning, the stuffiness, the sweat in these small shtibelach were sometimes, God forbid, like the gas chambers in the intensity of what you had to do there. And here these are the shomrim, these are the guards standing at the ramparts of Jerusalem. And so it is with shtibelach throughout Jerusalem. And I see then that the lesson of my beloved mother comes now into the synagogue and into the community, which is really the essence of what her life was, together with, first and foremost, the life of her family. When she was born back then in 1922, she was the smallest and was to be the last of the Fishberg children. She had her older brother Alex and her older sister Sadie, who was 12 years older than her and practically brought her up, because after my grandmother, particularly when she was widowed, was constantly working in their jewelry and silverware store, there was nobody to bring my mother up except her darling, beloved sister Sadie, Sarah. And then there was Fega above my mother, and Esther, little Essie, the little one. And she was always telling us that she was considered to be the little one of the family. And here it is that she has actually outgrown them all. She outlived them all. All of her siblings passed away. Her father passed away, I would say, quite traumatically. Back then in 1934, when my mother was 12 years old, I would assume that from the little she spoke about her childhood before that, she was his darling, a child playing on his knees, and she told me how much she loved hearing him singing the songs of the Seder night, the Pesach Seder night, and she would talk about the voice that he had, that he said of himself that he was like the nightingale singing in the middle of the woods, because there was nobody to hear how beautifully he sang. He was involved very much in his craft. After they moved to London, there was no such thing as great welfare benefits for immigrants back in those days. If you had landsmen, people who came from the same area that you came from, then there was a chance that they would help you to set up. It was a huge struggle to set up a business in those days. And then, tragically, my grandfather, Avram Yeshua, passed away in 1934. My mother was just after her 12th birthday, And most significant to me is that among the possessions that I saw of hers in my childhood, and which is now in my possession, is a 1-volume Hebrew-English Bible that was awarded to her as a prize in her Hebrew school just after the death of her father, according to the date in the book. And her love of Torah, her love of Yiddishkeit, her love of the synagogue, her love of the organizations of the synagogue, the Ladies' Guild, and the community organizations around supporting projects in Israel, her love of WITZO activities, the women's activities supporting children's facilities across Israel. All of these were the love of her life, and this, I believe, developed in her childhood. But it was in 1939, after her 3 older siblings were already married and some had children, that the war began in September of 1939, when my mother was just 17 years old. And she often spoke about the Blitz and how it was in London during those days. She would tell us how she would often go to sleep in the basement of the Brady Jewish Girls Club in the East End of London, and how they would come up in the morning, and one morning the entire neighborhood around them was all in flames. My mother's life was saved by a miracle, let us call it the miracle of Auntie Leah. My mother's siblings, all being married and having little children, were all outside of London during much of the war. However, my mother would stay in the city with her mother in order to keep the shop. There was no fathers, only my grandmother and her daughter in the shop, and they had to be there during the war. And one time it happened that my mother's older brother, Alex, was in London for the weekend while his family were outside of London in their evacuation. And Alex was there and promised my mother to break the stresses of the war situation. He would take her out to Piccadilly Circus, to a club where they'd be able to hear music and dance and be entertained, and this was going to be on Saturday night. And they lived in the East End, which was a Jewish area. All the shops were closed in the East End. The synagogue life was very active, and my grandparents were involved in their synagogues, particularly on my grandmother's side. Her own mother, who lived with her until my great-grandmother's death, was notably from and descended from the great 17th century rabbi, Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, the author of the famous Shnei Luchos HaBris, the 2 tablets of the covenant, one of the great Kabbalistic works that came out before the arrival of Hasidus. And in those war days when people were sleeping in the London Underground and were in fear of their lives, that Saturday night, my uncle and my mother, before her marriage, were to go out to Piccadilly Circus, and then in the middle of Shabbos afternoon arrived Auntie Leah. Auntie Leah being the wife of my late grandmother's brother. And Auntie Leah came and, of course, was offered tea on Shabbos afternoon, and was talking and was talking and was talking and was talking and was talking. And she didn't stop talking. It was quite impossible to leave while Auntie Leah was there. And so my mother and her brother had to forego the Saturday night outing into the city. And the following morning on the news, they heard that there was a direct hit upon the place that they were supposed to be going to, and more people were killed in the stampede, with them actually killed by the bombings. There was another occasion when my mother, then already married, was also narrowly saved by what was called a German doodlebug. We heard this in our childhood, how the doodlebug was a kind of bomb that as long as you heard the engine going, you knew it was not going to drop. The moment the engine stopped, you knew it was going to drop. And this one dropped on the corner of St. John's Wood Road and Liston Grove. We always saw the bomb site in our childhood. An enormous apartment building was struck about 150 yards away from my parents who were waiting for a bus one evening. So that was London in the war, and it happened that my father was not able to serve in the army during the war because he had had a very serious ear operation, removing his adenoids back in the late 1930s. And miraculously, God brought my mother and father together through a neighbor suggesting a shidduch, and they met, and indeed they did marry on January the 17th, 1943. And in fact, on the day of their wedding, that was when what was called the phony war came to an end. We were always told about how at the wedding feast, which was held in my aunt and uncle's house, my mother's brother in the house he lived in Golders Green, that in the middle of the wedding feast being held in this private house, because this was wartime, in the middle my uncle turns on the radio with loud blaring music. And it seemed very strange for a wedding feast, but he was trying to drown the sound of the German bombers that were now opening up what became the much more serious part of the war. However, after their wedding, my parents moved into the neighborhood of Maida Vale. Maida Vale in London, it's, if you're coming from Marble Arch on the Edgware Road going northwards, then about 2.5 to 3 miles down the road is the Maida Vale area. And my parents moved into their first rented apartment in the Maida Vale, Florence Court, number 27 on the 6th floor after their marriage. And then they were to become members of the St. John's Wood Synagogue, where my mother had a continuous active membership through the days of the old building, now the New London Synagogue, so-called, the very handsome and elegant Victorian building. And then in the 1960s, in the sometime after my bar mitzvah, which took place in the old St. John's Wood, the whole community moved to a very great new building just near the St. John's Wood station, and they call it now they call this the Shul in the Wood. And this is what we knew as the St. John's Wood Synagogue, a synagogue that was built to hold the thousands of people that all wanted to be in the main synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And at the time of these great events, indeed, the synagogue was very full, but on an average Shabbat, there would be a fairly sparse congregation. And for me personally, the synagogue had little attraction, and it was then that I drifted away. And the truth is that so did my two brothers, and my parents together had 3 very different sons, each of whom went in a completely different direction. And somehow my mother's great art was to juggle between us. Not long after they moved from the East End of London, where my mother lived before she was married, into Maida Vale, where they lived, my father and mother, after they were married. In the early 1950s, they were able to purchase near their rented flat in Florence Court this house, which just stands off the Maida Vale in a very beautiful little cul-de-sac with its Tudor-style facade and a 3-floor London family house with a little garden in the front and a garden in the back. And I was told that in the very early 1950s that the price of the house was £5,000. Well, it, I believe, would today sell for several millions. It's been long not in the hands of our family, but it was in this home that my parents and the three brothers were growing up, and we were quite a crowd, us three together, with our battles and our quarrels and our different pursuits and our needs for quiet and our needs for loud music and to hit footballs and to avoid getting hit by footballs. And somehow our beloved mother was keeping the peace between us and raising us, and also working. When my father required her services in his tailoring establishment, which was both a bespoke tailoring made-to-measure suit factory and shop, and my mother's was needed in the office, so she moved from her work in Whitechapel, as they called it, where she used to bicycle from Maida Vale to Whitechapel and back each day, even after she was married and before she started having her children. But that was becoming impracticable as we now lived in the Maida Vale, and she had her family, but she did have some staff at home, so she was able to help my father in the store. She was also an intrepid driver. Every week she would go on 3-hour journeys around London to the parts of the city in which she had been brought up as a child. And she knew very well when you got to Gardener's Corner that there you were by the commercial road. And she had, from my father's tailoring establishment, to deliver sometimes about 40 parcels to different tailors that were working out of their little homes across the East End of London. She would deliver the little rolls of cloth and lining and so on, and instructions on Monday, and on Friday morning get up to leave already at 7:30 on her journey around the city to collect up all the sewn pieces ready for the next fitting or for completion. And she was driving us three boys sometimes to our school, which was some way from the Maida Vale in Willesden, which was in those days a drive of about 25 minutes, to the Northwest London Jewish Day School. And the Northwest London Jewish Day School expressed the aspirations of my parents living after the Holocaust, having seen and been very much aware of what had happened to the Jews of Europe and the way they had been chosen out by the Nazi persecutors because of their origins. And the Northwest London Jewish Day School was designed to induct Jewish children into Judaism with a knowledge of the Siddur, of the prayer book, and a knowledge of the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and some biblical history, and certainly to inculcate a love of Israel through the annual Tu B'Shvat campaign to put stamps on a tree. You'd sell the stamps to people, each one for a penny, until you made 7 shillings and 6 to buy a tree for planting in Israel. And my parents' aspiration was both for that education and for success in the 11+, the exam you had to take in order to get into a decent secondary school. So that was the work of those years in what was a very beautiful neighborhood. The Maida Vale is right next to the so-called Little Venice of London with its canal system, and has other very great beauties. And we did grow up there, and my mother raised us. And the part of her life that I would particularly like to speak about as an example of the Tzadikos of Israel is the life that she had after she'd brought us up. That in itself was quite enough to have on her hands 3 very boisterous sons, and that was really the fact that thank God we've all made it, and each one is, thank God, in a good place. That was in itself a very great achievement, I would say, for ever and ever, inculcating into us everything that she did. But when my father passed away after a very long period of decline in which my mother was his chief carer. My parents had already moved from the big house, and they moved to near the shul in the wood, which was their local synagogue and community, and they bought a much smaller flat in a building just off the London Finchley Road, within 10 minutes walk or less of the St. John's Wood Synagogue and all of the amenities of St. John's Wood High Street, and the Panzer delicatessen with its kosher products and its kosher challahs on Shabbos, and in those days kosher milk and kosher cheese. And in fact, interestingly enough, that is returning today. And from 1986 until the end of both of their lives, my parents lived in this building, Lyndhurst Court, on the Finchley Road, just near the St. John's Wood Synagogue. And indeed, with her family, it was the synagogue that was the center and the focus of my mother's life. In the early years, she was on the Ladies' Guild of the synagogue, preparing for special occasions in the synagogue, preparing for the sukkah, preparing for fundraising evenings for one cause or another. But in the years since they moved into their smaller flat in Finchley Road, the center of her communal life became an organization known in England as JACS. That is the Jewish Association of Cultural Societies. My mother had left school, I believe, at the age of about 15, went straight into working in the shop, was working continuously, both in the shop after her marriage and in my grandmother's shop, and then coming to my father's shop. And then after my father was incapacitated, my mother was working with a nephew in the jewelry business. And so she didn't stop working really and come into her own until those years in her 60s, when she started participating in this society. She was a woman that read. She was a woman that loved to listen to music and to go to ballet and opera and theater and watch the movies on the telly and all kinds of entertainments. They go visiting to the art galleries of Prague and Leningrad and Petersburg and so on. And she greatly appreciated a wider outlook. And JACS was an organization which then in the 1980s was for those in their 60s who wanted to, now that they're retired, go on outings, go on theater trips, go to visit castles and stately homes, go to the opera in Glyndebourne, and go for ventures further afield to the sea for a few days and so on. And my mother became highly active in this organization, which in those days in the St. John's Wood branch, which was in fact just one of a whole national network of branches. There were maybe 250 to 300 or more people at an average weekly event. And indeed, before my father passed away, he would sit at the entrance to the communal hall where the JACS meeting would be held, be it a lecture, a musical performance, some other kind of event. And my mother became the main spokesperson of JACS. She became the chairman of the organization. This was after her beloved older sister Sadie, alea shalom, had passed away. And little Essie is no longer little Essie, but she is coming into her own. And she becomes the chairperson of JACS. And although there's a rule with JACS that the chairperson has to retire after a certain time, they changed the rules for her and had her serve again and again and again and again. And of course, the 6-year-olds became 70-year-olds, and then they became 8-year-olds, and the numbers were being more and more depleted. And my mother was still running around London in her car at the age of 93 and would go from her home to Golders Green to buy the kosher biscuits and bring the kosher milk, no longer available in her neighborhood of St. John's Wood, bring them from Golders Green for the Jack's meeting. And she was the chairperson and the bottle washer and serving the tea to those who were older than her. And indeed, at her Shiv'ah, just a week and a half ago, there came a woman from Jack's who has attained the age of 101 and is still lucid and mobile with a memory, and she offered us her consolations in London. But the numbers became more and more depleted until it was necessary for my mother to give up her post in Jack's. In fact, just 2 years ago, it became necessary to close the organization, and that is a chapter unto itself in the life of my mother. Besides her communal activities, the other joy of her life was her family. And as I came to Israel first in 1980 to live, and we moved into the Mea Shearim district in 1988, I would estimate that since that time, my mother probably flew from London to Israel and back again about 70 or more times. She would always come at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. If there was a special occasion, she would come 3 times a year. If it was a bar mitzvah, or then the weddings, thank God. And she was assiduously following her family and growing with us until her very last years. And indeed, she was at the wedding of our son Nosson, Hashem Yacheu V'Yishmereu, in 2015, the Rosh Chodesh Shevat of that year. And she was with us for many other simchas, thank God, for bat mitzvahs, brisses, and thank God, the weddings. And she had the joy and the nachas of her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. And the lesson that comes from her last years is the energy with which, and this her last visit to Israel in Adar of the year Tafshin Ayin Vov, that is March of 2016, her very last visit, where she came to Bet Shemesh to visit our daughter with her daughters and children. She came to Tel Aviv, where she was with our son and his daughters. And every place that she was, she would dance. I called her the Savta Rokedet. In her later years, in her 90s, and she was always trying new things. She took up computer at the age of 80 and insisted on making birthday cards for all of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren with the computer programs, until she became frustrated with Windows constantly upgrading these programs and became baffled by this. But that was her love of her family, to send each one of them that she could a birthday card and a gesture. But her last lesson to us was Savta Rokedet, and indeed the dancing grandmother. She told me that in her flat in London where they lived, she would dance up and down to maintain her bodily abilities, even in the years of decline. Back then in her mid-90s, 93, 94, until in 1996, really, there set in a cognitive disability that she began to be unable to express herself. She'd forget names. She one time was trying to mention something to me, and I had no idea what she was talking about, and she really got rather infuriated with me because she was referring to something just near the synagogue, and I had no idea really what she was referring to, and she said, you know, and she just couldn't get the words out, and that was a cognitive disability which unfortunately did set in those later years. And For me, there was a tremendous lesson that's come out of this. It was a period that was accompanied by increasing physical disability, the disability to actually move around. And this came to the point where first she was more or less confined to a chair, could barely walk around the apartment on a frame, and then she was confined to her bed and up in the chair for a little while, and lost subsequently all ability to speak and even move or lift a finger in those last years. And watching this was a tremendous pain, and in retrospect one understands her frustration that her activity, all of her life, was now curtailed, and she could not do all the things that she used to do. She felt so constrained already because of all the activities that she had been busy with, and so this was itself a frustration to her. But I'll tell you the thing, that through the very great pain that my mother, without doubt, went through in those last years, the frustration and the increasing inability to connect with the world, I do believe that she was compos mentis and understanding on many levels to her very last days. I was privileged to be informed by my older brother David just on the 24th of December that I should come to London, and I was worthy to get a flight on the 26th and to arrive in London, and my mother was conscious and opened her eyes and saw. Well, now, months before this, as her cognitive ability to speak fell to nearly, not quite zero, she could give an expression, a faint smile, a faint murmur. But to me, the lesson was that the very essence of prayer, which was her whole teaching to me, that we are people of prayer, and she was not one that dealt very well with the formal prayers, although she loved the synagogue and she followed the services. But I heard many, many times from her in her later years how all the time she was so thankful to God for her blessings, thankful to God for her body, for her health, for her husband, for her family, for her goodness, always full of thanks, all the day she was full of thanks. And in the later years, she used more and more the expression to ask her family, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. And we are constantly speaking to a God that we cannot see, a God that so often we wonder, is God hearing, is God listening? And that indeed was her lesson, I believe, in those very painful and difficult last years of her, as she, without complaining, with sobbing and weeping, but no complaining, she taught us, as we could only speak to her and expect no response, that the next step is to know that we can speak le'ilui nishmata, for the elevation of our soul, our words of Torah, our words of prayer, Yiskada v'yiskadash Shmei Rabo, His great name be magnified and sanctified. My beloved mother, Imi, Merosi, Maras Esther Malko bas Rabbi Avrom Yoshua alei shalom, Esther Malko, the daughter of Bat Avrom Yoshua. Her essential lessons, I think, are simplicity. She was not particularly profoundly learned in Jewish text. She loved the Bible, and she loved the stories, she loved the traditions, she loved the songs, she loved the prayers, she loved every midrash she heard about it. But her simplicity in chesed, in kindness, her kindness to each and every one, her kindness to an employee of my late father who joined the shop as the office boy at the age of 15, a black boy from the Caribbean. Cecil Waldron, who, as Cecil became grey-haired in the age of his 60s and 70s, my mother never failed to have him at the house to help her out, to move some things, to bring down the Pesach cutlery and other tasks. And this was a chesed that went to so many people. My own ventures in offering Torah teachings through the internet, I would say, really did come about through her chesed, a simple act of chesed that my mother performed to a woman that was one of the very many that she helped years and years ago, a blind woman that lived in North London in Stamford Hill, an hour's drive from St. John's Wood on a weekday afternoon through the rush hour traffic, and my mother would drive to Stamford Hill to pick this woman up from her house, to take her to the Jewish Blind Society, and after the meeting to take the woman back to her home. And there was a person on the staff of the Blind Society, an American woman, that wanted to start a cassette tape library, taking advantage of the new technology then back in the late 1970s, 1977, that my mother was reading books into a microphone, fiction and stories, and she said to me, well, why don't you do something? She saw me growing my beard and putting on my dark Lubavitch coat and Lubavitch hat, and she said, well, why don't you do something? So I took the book of Eliyahu Kitov, translated into English by Rabbi Nachman Bullman, the Book of Our Heritage, the book by Rabbi Eliyahu Kitov, going through the whole circuit of the Torah year, through the months and through all of the festivals and all the days of observance, marking out their observances and their midrashim, the tales and folklore surrounding them. And this was by reading this book over the course of the year onto cassette tapes. I was already getting the mitzvah, goreres mitzvah, the mitzvah of my mother turned into my mitzvah. And then in the year 1980, when I was thinking, what am I going to do when I moved to Israel, I decided, having been working in British Broadcasting Corporation World Service as a commentator and producer, I would try to produce Torah cassettes for children's education and adult education. With that project that I came to Israel in 1980, and as the internet exploded onto the scene in the 1990s, and particularly with broadband, it became possible to broadcast classes as now you can stream audio and video so simply. That all stemmed from my mother's act of chesed in her simplicity. Her simplicity, simple chesed, simple love and joy with people, with her family and with her friends and with the members of the JACS, Jewish Association of Cultural Societies, and with people that she would meet, people that she would encounter no matter where. She had a lovely word and lovely smile for everybody. Not that she was without principle, she could be very firm and stern, but was in no way a matriarch. She was a woman that followed the ways of gentleness, kindness, and drew people to Hashem through her heart-winning smile, through keeping up with everybody, her three very different children, her variety of very different grandchildren, all in their own different directions, and her great-grandchildren, a special relationship for each one, for her many nieces and nephews, a special word. Having, I think, lost her father at the age of 12 and gone through that appalling suffering of the Blitz, I think she knew very well what suffering was, and perhaps those very harsh experiences were what lay behind her very gentle expression. Well, my mother particularly loved the closing chant of the synagogue service, Adon Olam. And that really expresses everything about her faith and her life. And now, having entrusted her body into the hands of Hashem, may she rest in peace and enjoy the radiance of Gan Eden, the radiance of the Shekhinah, and rise from level to level and be Melitzas Yosher. Let it be a protector of her people, Esther Malka, the queen, who goes into Achashverosh to ask for mercy for Klal Yisrael, for all of us, for all of our families, all of our dear ones.
Hashem